Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's John. This is Corey. Welcome to our OBC podcast. Are we calling it a podcast?
Until we have a better name. You can come up with a name.
The podcast. It's going to be the best podcast you've ever heard.
Yes.
Today we're talking about reading and why it's important to read, why both of us have kind of fallen in love with reading over the years, even though at some times in our life that might not have been the truth, and how it's beneficial for your faith and for your godliness.
Yeah. And so we're going to talk about reading in general, but we want to have a disclaimer of this is after the fact. This is assuming that I have read my Bible today, if we want to say that. This is assuming that we know that reading Scripture is more important than reading any other book in the world. Like it's what we need. Jesus is the Word, it tells us in John 1, and Jesus tells us in John 15 to abide in Him. So by reading, we are abiding in Him. 1 Peter says that the Word is living and abiding. So like if we are born again, we're actually born again by the abiding Word, by Jesus, His work and being in us and the Spirit.
Encounter Him more through, specifically through the Word.
Through the Word, it is how we know more about God, which leads to more understanding of God. And again, Jesus says when He's being tested by the scribes in Mark 12, what's the best commandment? He says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so we're going to kind of talk about, this is our mind, but it starts with, you need the foundation of the Scriptures, because that is the first place you should go for wisdom and understanding. More importantly, it's just the place you should go to know God.
Right.
Because it is Jesus. Jesus is the Word. So we have to start from that.
And books are a way of hearing the wisdom of people who have saturated their life in the Word.
Yeah.
So if you ever kind of notice yourself kind of, like we're saying, the disclaimer is read the Scriptures first and foremost, but that doesn't mean only read the Scriptures. I don't like Jesus didn't only read the Scriptures. Paul didn't only read the Scriptures. Actually, Paul, multiple times in the New Testament, is referring to outside of Old Testament writing. He's referring to a writing that somebody else has done in his day and age. And so reading has always been a part of God's people. And like for me, I love reading. That's like when we go to Disney, my favorite ride is the Spaceship Earth, because you get to go by the Gutenberg press. And if you're looking at like the spread of the gospel, the ability to read, the ability to print books, it is one of the primary ways that the written word is one of the primary ways that God has chosen to help people spiritually develop. And so if we neglect reading, and if we neglect that wisdom that people who have followed Christ for so long and are dead and gone, and they're probably more spiritual giants than we are, if we neglect their writings, then we are neglecting wisdom that God has given us throughout the ages.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important for us to read. And we're going to talk about why. And reading our Bible, number one, and we talked about this before, but reading in the morning is important. I don't care when you do it, as long as you do it. Right. But reading in the morning is important because it starts your day in truth and not subjective truth, like the real everything, God's truth. And that is the way we start our day and have, we're going to say this a lot, I'm sure, but a biblical worldview, like everything we should do should be through the lens of the Bible and through the lens of the gospel and everything we do. So
before we get into like the nitty gritty of what we're talking about in your daily reading or your daily like Bible reading and all that kind of stuff, what breakdown percentage would you say is like time spent in Scripture, time spent reading? Do you do those two at the same time in your Bible study in the morning, or do you do those at separate times?
They're separate. There's been different seasons of life where I would read my Bible, and then I would read the Valley of Vision, which is Puritan prayers, or I'd read something else to supplement it. But right now in life, with where I'm at with an almost 2-year-old and just the way life works, is I just have that time in the morning. Like that's the number one priority of me reading my Bible reading plan, which is a Bible in the Year plan that has like Psalms and Gospel and some other scriptures like every day. I don't know. You asked me. Was that it?
Yes, it was. Part of what I'm getting at is we are pastors. We have that time to sit and read, and that's actually good for our spiritual life, which is good for our work life and all that kind of stuff. For somebody who's going and working a 9 to 5 and they don't have time necessarily during the daytime, I've heard people say like the breakdown of your reading scripture versus reading books, if you're doing like a morning devotional, should be about 35% book, and the rest of that percentage is Bible. Like, make sure that the Bible is a more significant chunk, because not everybody can go to their office and dive into a spiritual book.
Gotcha.
So it's...
Yeah, I think the Bible should... Yeah.
Yeah, so the point is that the Bible is the main nutrients, but that's not to neglect other nutrients. If you only have time for one, do the Bible.
Absolutely.
If you have time for both, try to make sure that your morning quiet time is not just the Bible, though that is sufficient and good, but it's really helpful to get wisdom through books as well in that time.
And we're going to talk about what kind of books, not all the books.
Yeah, so tell me,
yes,
how did you fall... Is it appropriate to say fall in love with reading, or is that like a bit too romanticized?
It is romantic, but I think it's happened.
It's done.
Yes.
How did you fall in love with reading?
I don't know how, because even in first grade, when they pick the fast readers and the regular kids, I was in the regular kid pile. Like, I was good at math. Reading comprehension was horrible. I remember all through elementary school, I had horrible reading comprehension, and I think there was reading comprehension tests.
Yeah.
And it would prove
Which is so much pressure for a kid.
I know. I'm sorry, I'm not good at reading this book on a timer with 30 other kids in here, and you're going to tell me how good I did on it?
But that is a problem, the education system being wrapped around, tell me details of what you read instead of tell me the story arc of what you read. That's for a different podcast, a different day.
I don't know what a story arc is, but I believe you because it sounded so fancy.
Well, thank you. So... But you don't know necessarily as a kid where it came from, but where did you start noticing it develop?
Definitely in the last 5 years, perhaps. It has always been something I knew I should do and wanted to do, but you don't do it in your 20s, especially when you're in college, because you are forced to read. Reading, so there's not time to read what you want to read. And if you do that, you feel bad, like, I should be studying.
Yeah.
And
it's only every so often that you'll get a book that you're forced to read that you're like, man, that was life-changing.
But it's still not, you didn't choose it, so it's different. Yeah. There's just a difference. But definitely just in the last few years, and I think that was when we talked about it in the Will of God podcast, but when I went back to Liberty, I think I fell in love with reading during getting my master's. I was reading and I didn't really get it, but then I didn't read a lot of textbooks during that. I mean, I had my systematic theology gigantic book and a couple other giant books that I read, but it was reading those other little books. And one of my favorite books I read was the last book I read in there. So I think I learned to read, and it kind of gives you a system and you learn how to read fast. I'm a slow reader for certain things. So there's no excuse to not read if you're slow at reading or have bad reading comprehension. There's hacks. There's ways to get better.
Yeah, I remember being a kid. So I fell in love with reading early. That doesn't mean I did it all the time, but I had I thought it was awesome. So I remember as a kid, I would walk through our house, and every single night my dad would lay in bed with his lamp on. And I remember always walking in, and he always had a book in his hand, always. And so from the time I was really young, I was like, oh, well, I look up to my dad a lot. I feel like that's what and he was a really successful guy. So I was like, oh, that's what successful, well-rounded people do. They read a lot of books. And so from a really young age, I saw that as a value in our home, that my dad kind of always was putting on display of making sure that you're a reader. So going to the elementary school, middle school age, I was a really good reader, really good. I was in SLD, so specific learning disability, for math. Could not do math to save my life, but I could read anything. I could do history. And so I felt also celebrated when I would read. So I was always like, okay, this is, I know I'm smart. I know, and I don't say that in any arrogant way, but like, this is what I'm good at. This is everybody has gifts and talents, and I knew I wasn't good at at math. But so I fell in love with it at a young age, and then we got into like early high school, and I just became a believer. And I took that like good side of reading and then just got arrogant with it, because I would read stuff that was way too hard for me to fully comprehend, but I'd use all the words, and I would talk about what was in it as if I like understood it fully, and I totally didn't. And so went through a teenage arrogant stage. And then in college, I did my undergrad in pastoral studies, and so that was a good, like, some good reading there. But now there's another transition after that whole season where you're young and you're single and all that, into now you have kids, and every single day is a toss-up whether you're going to have time to do stuff or not. It's a toss-up of whether or not you're going to sleep the night before, and so this love for reading, this prioritization of reading both the scriptures and outside books, it's like, it's got to be an intentional thing in your life. There's no way to do this or to be an avid reader and not be intentional about it. But if you look throughout all of, like, humankind, the people who are really successful and are really changing things and are really making a difference, they are readers. And so for any, like, younger person who wants to be successful, like, get a book in your hand. If you don't have a book in your hand, you're not growing to the potential. Doesn't mean you're not going to do anything, but, like, there's a potential that you're not going to reach unless you are actively growing through reading. Yeah. So, Corey, for you, is there anybody specific? We talk about everybody, not everybody, but most people who are successful are pretty avid readers. Is there anybody in your life that's somebody you really look up to that was an avid reader that encouraged you? Yeah, several.
My mom was kind of that way that you said. She read a lot. She still reads a lot, even just for fun and for learning. My dad always read practically. Like, he will study how to do something he wants to do. Yeah. Like, no, he'll sit and read cooking books, and
that's problem solving still.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that. But then even at our church, Thomas Bates, who has been one of our deacons and serves in production and worship.
So Thomas Bates, if you're watching this, jump on, pal.
Thomas is one of those guys I look up to, and he reads a lot, and he listens to a ton of audiobooks because he has a commute. And so he's the kind of guy, when he says, hey, you should read this, I write it down. Yeah. And there's another guy who's an executive pastor who kind of mentors me. He's the guy I can call and ask questions. His name is Tom Demers, and he's at a church in Springfield, Missouri, a very large church, but he teaches and stuff, but he reads all the time. So he's given me some of the best practical church leadership books over the years. So those guys read. And as you said, anybody that you think is successful, like, they read. Right. Well, every year I look up, Bill Gates puts out his books that he read the last year that you should read. And I always look at them because he reads all the time.
Yeah. And even people from the past, like when we went to Springfield, was it in Springfield where we went to the Spurgeon Library?
Yes.
So we went to Spurgeon Library.
No, it was Kansas City.
Kansas City. Okay. We go to this library and Charles Spurgeon is one of my heroes, and his library is insane. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of books, and he was...
And like half commentaries.
Right, and he was an avid reader, and then he gets to the end of his life, and he's got all these books collected that he can give to universities. Yeah. And so it was just such a cool... I have on my channel, I have a kind of documenting that process of going through that library. It was just amazing to see how impactful an avid reader can be for their specific season of history, and how you and I can take that and, like, build upon that. Like, yes, he was an avid reader. He put out all these writings. I mean, Charles Spurgeon is one of the most prolific writers in all of history.
Yeah, he just always did it.
Yeah, and so, like, we can build off of some of the work that he did because we can read his works and their writings. So
for sure. I have one of his study Bibles that Dustin bought me. That was the first CSB Bible I had. Dustin gave me a Spurgeon study Bible, so it just has, like, his little handwritings on passages and things he said in sermons. So reading is important. Leaders are readers. What would you say are some of the benefits of being an avid reader? I think for me, the biggest thing is reading keeps me in the state of mind that I don't know everything. Yeah. It is forced humility. It is being open to that I don't know how to do this. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest takeaway. That's why leaders read and people who are successful read, because they're always, it's not like self-deprecating, like, I don't know everything, I need to learn. But it's opening yourself up to a new idea. And the fact that you can learn, I try to say this all the time. Like, I want people to say this about me and know that every interaction you have with another human being, you can learn something from them. Always be willing to learn. And I'm very hard on myself, like, naturally, it's my personality. So reading, the more I'm reading, the more I can accept constructive criticism. Right. Like, helpfully, instead of being attacked.
It's a way to never be the smartest person in the room.
Because you're not.
admitting I'm not the smartest
You're
person.
not.
That's why I'm reading this book, because I don't know everything. I don't have everything together.
In books, I always say, like, there's podcasts, even like this, that you can listen to that are helpful, but a book has been, like, poured into.
Yeah, for months and months and months.
And edited and thrown away and brought back, and which means somebody thought this is worth your time.
Yeah, the amount of distilled content you can get from a book. Like, you could listen to 10 hours of a podcast from an author, and you could probably get the same information. Yeah. But if you just spend 4 hours reading the book, it's so distilled and so compact, and great illustrations. And if you take good notes, you can reuse that content.
Absolutely.
Like, and not in a way that you're stealing it, but credit the person and use the content. Yeah. Like, that's what the world is doing right now, of repurposing, no idea is new.
Yeah. And another reason I like it, when I read, I get creative, or I can problem solve better. I can be reading a book about, like, the theology of salvation, or soteriology, one of your words you learned in high school that you would probably throw around at parties. But it keeps you thinking. I could be reading a book about that and I'll be like, there it is. Like that's why I always have like a pen and paper around to just throw stuff down. If I ever get in like a rut, I need to like stop and read for like 15 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it could be. It sparks creativity. It's good for your brain. Like, you can look up the scientific benefits, but it helps your vocabulary. It helps just the way you speak and the eloquence of that. But it really is a brain workout. It helps your memory. It relieves stress. It's just good for you in general. And that's even if you're reading stuff that's not good, but we're only going to talk about reading stuff that's good.
Well, and I've noticed though too, like when I'm in a season where I'm reading more, we live in a distracted world.
1,000%.
If I'm not actively reading, we'll get into a little bit more of this later, but like if I'm not actively reading, I'm probably actively distracting myself with YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or something like that. And so when I feast on those like bite-sized candy things of modern media, my ability to pay attention goes away. My ability to focus for long periods of time, or even just to like have somebody tell me something and keep the information. Like, there's something about reading that triggers in your brain this ability to actually use it, because you're not numbing your brain. You're actively like engaging the mind.
And you have this focus where you can kind of drown out other things, which we all know. You can watch a YouTube video and you're done and you're like, what happened?
And I feel gross. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just nothing. You retained nothing. You were actually paying attention to something else in the room and not watching it. And you can't do that with reading.
Yeah.
So
what place so one of the benefits of reading is rest. What place does like fiction play in your scope of reading?
I read fiction before bed, and whenever there's certain times where there's productivity is done for today. Right. But there are studies that show if you read fiction before bed, it helps you fall asleep, because if I read a book of learning before bed, that might like get the wheels turning. But if you just read a story, I read Lord of the Rings, all like the 3 books in the last couple of years. And that's what I would read a few pages. Yeah. 'Cause you can read Tolkien's talking about like a ditch for 3 pages and it's beautiful, but then you're like, I don't even know what these British words mean, but it would help me fall asleep.
And the thing with Tolkien is he'll talk about a bridge for 5 pages and then he'll talk about a battle for like 2 or 3 paragraphs.
And then all of a sudden the bad guy's here and the story's over and you're like, huh.
Man, pacing.
Something like that.
Who am I to tell him what pacing is?
So it's very restful to do that. And I think it's good for us to read. Like, story was invented by God.
Right.
Like, and it's a way for us to communicate things. And some of the best books that have ever been written are a much bigger tale.
Right.
But their story.
Right.
The Bible is the best story of all time. It's all intertwined and all perfect and amazing, and God uses people. And
but that gospel reality, or like the story arc of the Bible, so the meta narrative, is written on our hearts. And so like something like, for me, I read Harry Potter all the way through. I've read it through twice now. And that story arc of there is evil out in the world, and there is a person who's the Christ character, the Christ archetype, and they defeat the evil. It's like that is encouraging to have that in everyday reading and writing. And so even going to bed reading fiction, I could still rest in the gospel in those moments. I can still see beautiful pictures of the gospel throughout anything that I'm reading.
Yeah.
But for me, I love fiction because it helps to, it sparks my creativity. If I read good fiction and I love kind of the more creative side of life, it sparks creativity for me. And I don't know why it is, but it causes me to imagine in the way that people describe scenes and all that kind of stuff.
It's because someone else creatively wrote this.
Right.
And so it sparks something in you.
It gets, like right now I'm reading Brandon Sanderson's like The Night's Way or something like that. And it's just so, the detail that he writes with is incredible. But he also writes like 2,000 page books, and that's wild. So I'm going to read this one and probably be done. But yeah, fiction.
I read one book this year.
Yeah,
Here
fiction, so helpful to rest. Have you ever read a book on a beach? It's amazing. So
yeah. I've read Ernest Hemingway books on vacation the past few years, so I've read all of his, and just because that's one of those people who stood the test of time, like he's been famous for 100 years, and I read The Old Man and the Sea a few years ago, and I was like, what? I don't understand why I love this so much, but it's good. It's good for the soul and for rest.
So what do you tell somebody who says, hey, Corey, I'm not a reader. Don't push your wild reader ideology on me.
Yeah.
What do you tell that person?
Like we said, people who read are open to learning.
People who read succeed.
Sure, whatever you want to say. I'm not going to say that to a person's face. I'm going to think that, like, are you closed off to learning? Because I don't know how you argue against it.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I typically say start small. If you're,
you're saying that. Yeah, you kind of asked the question of like if someone's like, I don't want to read, I don't like this. That's
both.
But absolutely,
because like first off, you got to convince of the why. So the why would be what you just said. The how is more like, hey, just start with small chunks. You don't. I don't even read in big chunks. I can't sit on a couch and read for an hour. I read for like 15 minutes and then put the book down, and maybe later in the day I'll read for 10 or 15 minutes more.
Yeah.
But
there's some weeks where I read a whole book, and some weeks where I did not read.
Right.
It just happens.
That's life, especially with kids.
It's long-term consistency.
Right.
But yes, and a big thing for someone who doesn't read, don't read something you don't want to read.
Right. It's not going to help pushing through.
Everything out there. Right. Every single thing, which is you have friends and people in your circle of influence. Ask them what you should read, what you should start with.
I started reading this Puritan book that we were given. I love the Puritans. I absolutely love reading Puritan writing. This book was terrible.
Yeah.
I read about 10 pages. I read 25 pages. I wanted to give it a little bit of a shot. Got in, and I was like, this ain't going to work, man. Yeah. So I put it back on the shelf. I'm not going to pick it up again. I might throw it away. I don't know. Yeah. But if it's not going to be helpful for you, if it's not going to be beneficial for you, there's just no reason to try and force that to happen.
Yeah. That doesn't happen very often, but it is okay to stop reading something because there is a lot. And we'll get into how you decipher what you should read and what not to read. And it just comes with learning, and it's okay. Right. Life is short, but we got time. Like you can read a lot of books, but from now until the time you see the Lord.
So we talked about like the benefits of reading. We talked about how you would address somebody who says they're not a reader and they don't want to read. But like somebody, maybe say somebody watches this and they're like, I want to get into reading, but I don't know really how to find good books. How would you say is the best way to find the best books for that person?
Yes. You ask people that you trust. Like we kind of talked about who's a reader that you look up to. That's the best way you can make a list is ask people.
I think for both of us, Thomas does that a lot. Like we ask him like, what are you getting into? He tells us and we instantly follow.
Yes. And you'll learn to like authors that people have given you, but really if you're a part of our church, ask us or ask your Bible study teacher, ask anybody that you look up to. Another way, once you get into that, is like if I really love a book, especially like on doctrine or something, a lot of times that author had a book that they use that they quote more than any other book. Yeah. So sometimes I'll just go look at the end notes and you'll see like, I want to read that book. Yeah. And that's why one of the books on my list is from another book that I want to read because it's quoted like 50% of all the quotes. And you're like, well, obviously
sounds good.
everything that we're reading that's worth reading is there's somebody behind it.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about theology and people who have stood the test of time with their doctrine that it's good and it's worth reading. It's worth people writing about.
Right.
So that's a good way.
Yeah. Footnotes is huge. If you're trying to find like the other, especially when you read less technical writing, they'll have a lot of footnotes for the more technical writing. And if you find that subject or that area that you're like, hey, this I'm really into right now. Like right now, I'm studying through the book of James. James 2:24 says, is that the verse that says faith without works is dead? Or no, that's the one that says specifically, we are not justified by faith alone, we're justified by works. That's a confusing verse in the scripture because that kind of goes against what a lot of the others. So you got to get that verse into context. You got to read that book within the rest of the book or rest of the New Testament. And so I'm looking up these commentaries. I just say, how are other people dealing with this verse and trying to read it for how James intended it to be read. And in those commentaries, there's a lot of books of like, hey, this person goes so much deeper into it. So if you want to dive into this, read this book. And so I think anytime that I've read and I've really been caught by a quote or been caught by like a section that has a footnote, I'll write that footnote down and go to that. And sometimes it's a website, sometimes it's an article or something like that. Yeah. And that's helpful, but more often than not, it is a full book.
And man, things that are popular today, I've read a lot of leadership books. Yeah. I just like them. They grab me. That's one of those, like, I like the business world idea of stuff. And the more I read these books, the more you realize it literally comes from two authors. Right. Most of the stuff that happens today is from Dale Carnegie, who wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People in the 30s, almost 100 years old now, and then Peter Drucker. Yeah. Because somebody was quoting Peter Drucker in a book, and I was like, well, I should read one of those. And then I read it and was like, everyone stole everything from this guy.
I've read this book. I know it.
This guy wrote this in the 70s, like the essential or the effective executive. And like every leadership book now, you can't say they didn't steal his ideas.
Right. And I'm okay with that.
I don't care either. Yeah,
for those two guys, they stole leadership values from other places. Like the Bible. And it's not stealing. It's saying like, hey, this idea has impacted me. Let me write my thoughts on this. That's not stealing. That's fair use. That's actually what the term is.
And it's in a new context. That's why we were talking about this today about worship songs, that scripture tells us to write a new song and to sing to God a new song. Nothing wrong with old songs, but there's something about a new person experiencing something and saying, this is how I saw it, or this is how it manifested in my life. And that's why it's good to keep reading, because it's seeing it happen in someone else.
So you use footnotes in any other ways you find like good books?
I mean, anything that's recommended, I guess, when you read. I use this app called Goodreads. I think it's an Amazon app where you keep track of how many books you want to read in a year, but you keep track of I want to read and I have read this. Yeah. And it's kind of like social media, but no one really uses it, but it'll recommend things. But it's really, if anyone tells me to read a book, like people recommend books to me faster than I can read books. Right. I don't read fast. So I just keep putting them in there. So I think my list is like 40 and that'll never go to zero. Yeah. It's just always, but the good ones, I read the ones that
are most pressing.
Yes.
Well, and for me, what I end up doing is what you'll see is repetition in recommendation. So I was recommended this from this person and that person, and I saw it online, and all these people I trust. So that's going to prioritize for me. That's going to move
absolutely move. And that's why it's good to be in community, because people who read, like Arthur will give me books to read. You'll give me books to read. Like people just throw them around. Yeah. And if you hear it 2 or 3 times, and we went to this conference a few months ago and just got a bunch of books, and I haven't started any of them, but they're there. So
that's where I got that Puritan
book. A bunch of pastors are saying, we wanted to give you this for free, you should read it, it's probably worth it.
Another good way is if you go on like the Gospel Coalition or Desiring God or Christianity Today, a lot of websites will do a best of 2022 or 2021, and it's worth backlogging those and looking at the books over the past couple years, because they're still relevant.
Absolutely.
And one of the big things you need to avoid when you're looking at reading is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. Just because something is new does not mean it's better. And so
the older I get, the more I'm the opposite.
Right.
Like I'm just trying to read dead guys now.
Right.
That not that old, but like.
But it's shocking how relevant it is for today, because the human heart is the human heart, no matter what age of history. But just making sure you don't get caught up in the chronological snobbery of I only want to read the newest thing and all that. It's like there's
that's good for fiction because then it's
fiction.
like no one has told the story yet. Like if they're going to make a movie about it, then
but the classics, man, the fiction classics, are classics for a reason.
Absolutely,
I would definitely stick into that. So you use Goodreads. Do you use any other thing for recommendation?
Just searching things, and like you said, those websites that you like, and I want us to be good about having recommended books, but it's really for right now. Just ask us.
Yeah. So what's on your docket? What's like the next thing you're looking at reading?
So I wouldn't recommend this, but I'm like 50% of the way through like 4 books right now. And so I don't know how I got caught up, but they're just different, which is another reason if you're not good at reading like I am and you lose, like then you can just switch books. Like you can read for like 12 minutes and be like, not right now. So you just read something else.
Do you have any qualms with like stopping a book?
We kind of talked about that. I don't do it often. I'm a tenacity kind of guy. Like I need to barrel through. But if I feel like I've got the point and there's something else in that I'm really excited, like move on. It's okay. Sure. It is okay. Like if you learn something, they already got
your money. The authors
if you learn something, then you can definitely move on for that. But I've been listening to this series that John Piper wrote called The Swans Are Not Silent, which is biography of church leaders started at, there's Luther and Calvin and Augustine, and then there's John Bunyan and Jonathan Edwards. Like he goes through all these, and they're really good. And they're only like 4-hour audiobooks, which is like a podcast.
It's so good, man.
That's a perfect audiobook, but it teaches you just enough about these people you don't know about that encourages you. Yeah. And
you want to grow in your faith, grow by reading good biography.
Yeah. This is I haven't been doing that. So this is kind of my segue into that. So I'm reading those. I'm on track to read the most I've ever read in my life. That's not a humble brag, but it's like happening. So I feel like
I don't know how you do it, man.
I don't know. It's just I don't either. Like I don't read a lot all the time. I just consistent, and we'll talk about it later. But how you do it. But that's there. I really want to read Pilgrim's Progress because it's good. The biography of John Bunyan. Yeah, he wrote it during his second stint in prison. Yeah, that second Swans Are Not Silent about suffering made me cry. Like I was pulling weeds listening to it, and I'm just weeping outside. Yeah. You couldn't tell because I was sweaty. But I want to read Pilgrim's Progress because outside of the Bible, that's the number 2 best-selling book of all time. Right. So I think it's worth it. That's one of those you're like, well, if it's the number 2 book of all time, you should probably read it. It's amazing.
It's totally worth it.
For sure. So those are the next ones. And I'm reading, in young adults, there's a group of us who've been going through Knowing God by J.I. Packer. But during that, he quotes this book from A.W. Pink called The Attributes of God. So that, because he quotes it all the time, that's now on the list for me to read. So those are, and I might be reading Harry Potter right now too. So that's I've never read them before. So
I pressured you.
Probably. And I don't know if you should read, I don't know if everyone was wrong with me growing up. Like I probably shouldn't have read it when I was in 5th grade.
Wrong.
Yeah, whatever. But
that's just me.
I'm a grown man now. I understand that this is made up and it's a story. And I have a biblical worldview to look through. So I'm on the 5th one now. So it's my nighttime.
Your nighttime read.
My nighttime read for like 7 minutes before I fall asleep.
Yeah.
So John, what are you reading right now?
So right now I'm in a couple different books. I'm reading Turning Points by Mark Knoll, which is like, what were the major turning points in church history that like, the Gutenberg Press was a major turning point in church history, those kind of things.
You told me to read it. It's on my list.
Yeah, it's a great book. And then The Way of Kings, Brandon Sanderson, that's that enormous.
That's fiction?
That's fiction. That's enormous. Like so many pages.
That's when it's good to have a Kindle. You can't see how many pages you have left.
This guy writes per year like 5,000-page books in this one series, and he's told people for the next 30 years, if he's allowed to be alive, for the next 30 years, he's going to be writing this series. So, dive into it. So I'm reading the first one going like, if this is like the best thing I've ever read, I'll get into it. But that's a huge commitment.
That's overwhelming. Also, if you don't like to read, don't just buy a short book. Right. Get that win.
Right. So, and then I'm on audiobook, I'm listening to Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And that's been a really good, like, I'm raising my son. He's 7 years old, Clive, and what that looks like to raise a boy well.
Which is like a sociology book, right?
Right, exactly. And it's Peterson, so it's got big words for no reason sometimes and all that,
smart.
but it's still really a good book.
So, John, you talked about commentaries when you are studying Scripture. What ones do you like, or what's a good way to get into that for people? Because most people don't want to buy a whole volume of someone's commentaries, but what's an easy way to get into that?
The best thing I can recommend for anybody is just get an ESV study Bible. Get a nice leather one. Get you one that you're going to want to pick up. I've had the paperback or the paper hardcover. It's nice. Get you a Bible that like you really look forward to holding it in your hands. Yep. And the notes in the ESV study Bible are awesome. It goes into enough detail that you really can get a grasp without going into so much detail that you get lost in the weeds. So
and like a big team wrote it together, so it's not just one person.
And I like Grudem. Grudem was like one of the main guys on that team. So I think study Bible, getting ESV one, that's huge. I think commentary sets, not everybody needs to do this, but like I use the Pillar New Testament commentary. I think those are like really practically.
But they don't have the whole Bible.
They don't. New Testament commentary. So I use that. I use some of the NIV application study, commentary set, and those are really good. But there's so many free resources online that you can use. What's the
and you can find J. Vernon McGee. Like my mom had those growing up.
Vernon McGee.
Yeah, he has that. He had the radio show, but a lot of his stuff is online for free.
Yeah,
but he is right down the middle of everything.
Yeah,
he is. So that's a good one to get into. That's not like he's not in camps. Like he is. He's very moderate in all of his stuff.
And there's also Henry.
Yeah.
What's his name? Henry.
I think his last name is Henry.
Matthew Henry.
Yeah.
So the Matthew Henry commentary set, like that is actually a really good commentary set, and it's on like every Bible website, Blue Letter Bible. For free.
Yeah.
So there's all these different ways that you can dig in without spending money. But if you are going to spend money, I would start with ESV Study Bible.
Or a study Bible you want to read.
Right. And then there's just this free read. I mean, J. Vernon McGee's a great teacher and really interesting to listen to because of his thick Southern accent.
Real thick.
So there's all different types of mediums of how you can read these days. What for you is your preferred method of reading?
The number one way, which hasn't always been, I learned this when I went to Liberty, was to use a Kindle.
Yeah.
Because it's a one-time investment and you can get any book on it if you have the internet, and they're usually a little bit cheaper, but the main reason is you can highlight things and then you can export your highlights.
Yeah.
So that is a very easy way to read a book and not have to reread it because you took good notes on it. And it's just easy.
That's the big thing for me. Searchable.
Yeah.
If I'm preaching or something like that, I can go back through thousands of highlights by just typing in the one word. And that's why
it's neat.
Yeah. I really like a physical book, but I had to move on from physical books because of how much specifically our jobs are. How can you recall what you've read?
Yeah.
Whether it's preaching or just talking to people about books or preparing curriculums, like there's so much that you have to recall. So what else? What are your other like?
I'll read a paper book if there was a season where I did that the most because there's something about holding a book. There's something about writing in the margins and having a highlighter. So for certain things, it's worth it. It's just kind of what you want. But like we said, like if it's for something that will end up being helpful for sermon prep in the future, I want that digitized so I can get it fast. And I also listen to audiobooks so when I drive to and from the church office, I always listen to an audiobook. And that's usually something that I don't need to take notes for. Those biographies right now. Oh, I'm actually listening to Brothers, We Are Not Professionals by
John Piper.
By John Piper, because it's 50% scripture. He's literally reading me the Bible with some notes in between of just reminding, like we are called to shepherd God's people. That's what we're called to do. So audiobooks for that. And we live in Orange County, so there's this app called Hoopla. So if you have a library card, you get free audiobooks. Yeah. So it's a good way to do it, and you don't have to pay a lot of money for it.
It's amazing. Yeah, I feel like we're so blessed to live when we live. You know, we have reading, the ability to even read. Most of human history, most people have not had the ability to read.
I just said we can, for free, get another human being to read you a book at 2 times speed because I'm in a rush.
Right, it's so crazy. So for me, I don't really like physical books. I get the value of it, but I like to be able to change font size. I like to be able to read in dark mode. I like all that. Yeah. And so the next step was the Kindle, and we both are big fans of Kindle. Jeff Bezos has not sponsored this podcast. Jeff, if you're out there and you'd like to sponsor a podcast,
please follow Jesus.
And then sponsor this. So Kindle's great. What I don't like about Kindle though is note taking is so much more difficult. Yeah. So I know you say that as like, yeah, you're wrong, but yes, I'm right, because you highlight something, that's great. But then like I like to take down my thoughts of what I was thinking at that moment, how that applied to life. And when you're typing on the Kindle, it's just so...
I didn't even know you could type on a Kindle.
Yes, it's so slow because it's the e-ink, so it's got to refresh like every time you hit a button.
I've never even tried.
Right. And so for me, what I have found is the best is either the Kindle app on my iPhone or the iPad. And I know people are like, how in the world can you read digitally? But once you're used to it, it's so much better to be able to like... take notes on anything, be able to import into different note-taking apps that I have, or like put it into Evernote and tag everything. It's just so much more helpful. That medium for me of doing it on iOS, having all my books anywhere at any time because I have my phone in my pocket, that's huge. And then I don't know if I should show this or not, but my ability to turn my phone red, like this is probably too far away from the camera, but like...
You can't even see it.
In the middle of the night, being able to read with a fully red screen where I'm not like, there's no blue light coming through and it's not waking up my wife because red light travels the least distance. For me, reading on a phone is a game changer. I read all of Harry Potter from my phone.
People are getting a sense of the nerd-tasticness of all of your systems right now.
Yeah, well, we like to optimize what we do.
Yes, absolutely.
So, but I would say, so that's for like the actual like physically reading. By far and away, my favorite way to read is by audiobooks because having kids, having to do chores, having to mow the lawn outside, I can get so much reading done. And I've noticed my comprehension is not all that different. If I come across something that's like really, really, really valuable, I'll stop there for a quick second, take a quick voice memo, and keep moving on. But I don't notice my comprehension being all that difference between audiobooks and reading. And I know there's a bit of me that like dies inside when I say that because I'm like, oh, but reading is such a wonderful thing, and listening to audiobooks is just such a great value.
Well, and it goes back to the why of you're always learning.
Yeah.
And you're always in that state of wanting to be better.
And I'm not as into music as I've ever been. Like
I tell you guys all the time, I'm cyclical. I'll go through audiobooks and music and like podcasts in like thirds of the year, but it's more audiobooks. Yeah, I can only listen to things that I don't need to take notes on. So if I do listen to an audiobook that, something really grabs me, I'll just pull out my phone and make a note at a stoplight or pause it. And until they get the technology where you can grab it and it puts it into text, they're working on it.
Yeah.
It's not happening yet, but...
Okay, so the point of reading is comprehension.
Yes.
It's not just doing it for the sake of doing it. How do you remember all the things that you've read and comprehend what you read and have it ready for recall whenever you need it?
This is where
it gets tricky.
I'm going to look real nerdy. So I have a really good system. And I stole it from someone else because you can find things on YouTube. So I, like I said, use my Kindle for highlights. So I have my Kindle set up to where it goes into this other service, this app called Readwise, and it's like the best thing I've done in a long time. So Readwise, I think, is like $9 a month, but it takes all my Kindle highlights, and then every day in the morning, it gives me a notification, and it gives me 5 highlights from all of my books. And so I have a bunch of books and highlights in there, starting from when I was at Liberty and started using a Kindle. So like some of my textbooks and some of my things about counseling and little things like that. And it'll just grab a little bit of those and I like refresh and read a quote of 5 books every morning. And it's kind of just a cool way to keep those in your mind. And you can set it to, I want more of this book, I want less of this, or turn a book off. And so you don't get it. But from there, those notes go into Notion, which is like Evernote or Apple Notes, but it's just
on
different.
Steroids, man.
You can do anything. It's overwhelming. I use it for this.
Yeah,
so all my book notes go in there. So any book that I read that is not really reading for pleasure, that is a leadership book or a theology book or a doctrine book or a spiritual formation, anything that I want to remember, I use Notion. Those quotes go in there. And then I kind of have this template of almost like a book report. So for some stuff, if I really want to get into it, I'll like every chapter, like you said, how do you write down? Like I'll pull out my phone and be like, chapter 12 in one sentence, this is what I read. Yeah. And then those quotes are in that chapter, and it just kind of goes through. So I can always go back. I can send them to someone, which is nice because it takes me like a little bit of extra time when I'm reading, but it's worth it. It might take me an extra hour on top of a book.
But then for the rest of your life, you've got all your stuff.
Yeah. I read a book during vacation called The Psychology of Money, and I took really good notes during it. But then I just sent it to my friends like, you guys don't need to read the book now. Yeah. Here you go. Here's Corey's nerd notes is what I call them. So I'll make those for things. But ReadWise has been really helpful for that. And even back to digital stuff, I can't read a Bible digitally. Can't do it.
I can't.
I am a paper Bible.
Yeah.
I have a really nice Bible, and I have 4 markers that I circle and highlight, and there's no rhyme or reason, but it just helps it come alive. So paper Bible, digital
books,
digital words.
I'm so glad I've gotten you into the digital book world. You resisted.
I'm not going to read on an iPad or my phone.
Hey, but you got into it. I mean, you've been reading on Kindle for a long time. But yeah. Okay. So your system is complex and works great and is optimized.
And it's hard work, and I hate doing it until I do it. It's like exercise. You're like, oh, I'm so glad I did that.
And the guy who kind of like put us onto that is a guy, Ali Abdal. He's got a YouTube channel. Great stuff if you're just looking for practical.
He was a doctor, so he's very smart.
Yes, be smart. My system is much simpler. I read something, I highlight it, and then I copy it, and I put it in Evernote. And I've got tags in Evernote. I've got probably 80 tags of different, like salvation, Holy Spirit, like different preaching topics, so that anytime I'm preaching on a topic, I can find that tag of that topic and find every highlight I've had in that topic. And instantly, in 2 minutes, I have 10 quotes, to pick from for a sermon and all that kind of stuff.
Can I tell you something sad?
Yeah.
You can just do that in Notion without tagging it.
Yes. But I've had this system for so long that I don't feel like migrating it over, because it's 9 years worth of notes for that. So that's my system is really, really simple, and I like it that way. Although Notion does the exact same thing that Evernote does, because Notion's the kind of thing where it can be as difficult or as easy as you want it to be. And so I just haven't fully switched over because I've had Evernote for so long. And so that's like, if it's something really good, I'll end up writing it on a sticky note and just like putting it on my computer monitor, just so it kind of keeps fresh in my mind. But really for me, the retention is more like content creation necessary. And so if I'm doing a YouTube video or a podcast like we're doing now or something like that, then I like to look through those quotes. I don't really take notes when I read the only reason I'll take notes when I read a fiction book is like, hey, this is a really great illustration. And so I've got on Evernote, I've got a quotes notebook, and then I've got an illustrations notebook. Gotcha. And that's, for those two things, and they're tagged with the same tags. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah. Whatever helps you remember stuff is worth it. And it is worth it to read something and be able to grab it back. There's also an app, if you do like paper books and you want to highlight, it's just called Highlighter or Highlighted. Yeah. And you just like scan it, and
sometimes it gets it wrong, but most of the time it gets it right.
You have to, sometimes I'll go back and be like that sentence is up there, and you're like, oh, okay.
But it works for the most part.
Yeah, it works. It helps you remember things. It's worth it to do. Yeah. So an easy way for reading comprehension that I've found, if you just do this, when you're done, you can write it down. You can just say it out loud. Summarize what you've read in one sentence, and then what was your favorite quote. If you do that every day after you read anything, it's helpful. Also, do that when you read your Bible.
Yeah.
That's the greatest thing I think I started taking away is you don't have to tell yourself, what did you read today? But when you sit down and you have your quiet time with the Lord, what was pick your favorite verse.
Yeah, what was the thought?
And that is the verse for today. Yep. That verse can help you evangelize. That verse, that is somebody's like, tell me about the hope that is laid up in you. Yeah. Like, here's this verse I have. If somebody needs encouragement and needs prayer, here's this verse I have. You can write that on a sticky note and put it in your pocket and carry it around all day. Yeah. And that is equipping, and it is good for everything. Right. It is good for all things. So it's an important thing to do. Yeah. So the big takeaways today is reading is just good for your brain, but it's good for your soul. Helps us to learn more about God, more about anything like parenting or whatever you're reading, but it's really restful, and really it's determining that's good content instead of just content that happens to you.
Right.
Like you're being proactive about it, intentional with it. So It's just good. It keeps you in a state of learning, which is humility. It's proving to yourself you do not know everything and you're willing to learn. So it's so important to read and to read often.
Yeah. Different modes of reading. You got digital, you got physical, you've got audiobook. They're all helpful, all good.
Whatever works. You can even do the summaries that people do.
Not as helpful,
which is cheating.
Good. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So if you made it this far, go ahead, leave in the comments what book you are reading right now, and that would be really helpful for all of us to kind of make our book list. So leave that in the comments below, what book you're reading right now. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it because that is so incredibly helpful. We love you guys. We'll see y'all next week.
Bye.